Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. We're very happy to have you here with us in this webinar hosted by the Global Partnership for Education, where we will be introducing ANLAS, a new GPE initiative to strengthen learning assessment systems. Before we begin this session, I would just like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping items. If you are facing any connection issues throughout the webinar, please let us know via email at webinars@globalpartnership.org. webinars@globalpartnership.org. Also, please note that we will have a question and answer session after the presentations. So please feel free to keep sending your questions throughout the session through the webinar's live YouTube live chat feature or by email at webinars@globalpartnership.org. So in other words, if you have a question, please send it to that email or simply type the question via the live chat feature in the YouTube screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. And please also, when you're submitting your questions, please do let us know your name, your organization, and if there are one of the presenters or speakers to whom your question is directed, please indicate that as well. Also, for your information, this session is also being recorded, and we will send to everyone who's participating today resources associated with the webinar, along with the link to the recorded session. So with that, we would like to start. This webinar, in which we will be discussing ANLAS, the new GPE initiative to strengthen learning assessment systems, will proceed as follows. Next slide, please. So my name is Ramya Vivekanandan, and I am a senior education specialist and thematic lead for learning assessment systems here at the GPE Secretariat. I will be facilitating the webinar overall and also giving the initial presentation, where we will provide an overview of the purpose of ANLAS as well as the ANLAS model. Then we will be joined by my colleague Ursula Schwantner at the Australian Council for Educational Research, ACER, is based in Melbourne, and she will be talking about the processes and tools associated with ANLAS. Just to provide a brief introduction, Ursula is a senior research fellow at ACER and is heavily involved in projects related to ACER's Center for Global Education Monitoring. She has been the prime counterpart in ACER for the development of ANLAS. The third presentation then will be specifically focused on the experience of piloting ANLAS in Mauritania. And this presentation will be delivered jointly by our colleague Ousmane Birba, who is based at the CONFEMEN, the PASEC Secretariat. He serves as a technical advisor for the PASEC program, and he was the main focal point for the ANLAS pilot in Mauritania. He's an economist, statistician, engineer with a solid background in statistics, econometrics, and analysis of education systems. And for this presentation, he will be joined by Mr. Mohamed Salem Ould Tafel Amar, who served as the national focal point for ANLAS in Mauritania, and who is a professor and researcher at the École Normale Supérieure of Nouakchott in Mauritania, and who is specialized in evaluation of education systems. Following the three presentations, we will then have questions and discussion, as I said. So next slide, please. So the first presentation, which I will share, is on the overall purpose of ANLAS and the ANLAS model. Next slide, please. So the purpose of ANLAS, next slide. So just to situate ANLAS within the broader context of GPE, for the Global Partnership for Education, high-quality learning assessment systems are seen as a key element for effective and efficient education systems as a whole. And in the GPE funding model, countries that apply for education sector program implementation grants from GPE are actually required to have a system or a mechanism in place to monitor learning outcomes, or a time-bound plan to develop such mechanisms. If they don't have such a system or mechanisms, they are supposed to use a portion of the GPE financing to develop these mechanisms. And so for GPE, it's very much seen as an important lever in terms of our overall support to countries. Because in order to be able to improve learning outcomes, which is one of the central goals of the Global Partnership and its support to countries, being able to monitor learning outcomes and to have sound and reliable data in that regard is crucial. GPE also offers results-based financing through the SPICs in relation to a number of transformational and sector-level results, including learning outcomes. Next slide, please. Also, GPE monitors the progress that countries make in terms of building good quality learning assessment systems through the GPE results framework, and specifically the indicator 15 of the results framework, which monitors the quality of learning assessment systems in partner countries. In order to further strengthen the capacity of these systems in our partner countries, a couple of years ago, we launched the Assessment for Learning, or the A4L initiative, which is seen as a complement to our support at the country level to reinforce learning assessment systems and to promote a more holistic measurement of learning. ANLAS, then, is a major component of A4L, and it aims to support and to provide guidance for our partner countries to build and improve national learning assessment systems. Next slide, please. So then what is ANLAS? It stands for the Analysis of National Learning Assessment Systems, and it's a resource that's provided by GPE through the broader A4L, or Assessment for Learning initiative. Next slide, please. Overall, ANLAS allows participating countries to systematically gather and analyze information about the National Learning Assessment System with the aim to inform the development and implementation of strategies to improve that system. And ANLAS is situated within the wider education sector planning process. Next slide, please. So why is it important overall for countries to analyze learning assessment systems? So we know that learning assessments are very important tools in order to have data on learning achievement, to monitor equitable educational outcomes, and to inform evidence-based policymaking and reform processes, and ultimately, hopefully, to improve teaching and learning practice. We also know that at the global level, the Education 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goal 4 has reinforced a focus on learning assessments as a key lever to establish and monitor education quality and learning progress. Next slide, please. And ANLAS then presents a tool to analyze the overall system. So as I said, ANLAS is embedded in the broader education sector planning process. And what this means is that the idea of conducting an ANLAS is that it should be a part of the country's broader education sector analysis and planning process, because the idea is that in conducting an ANLAS, it would allow a country to formulate strategies to improve the learning assessment system and to integrate these strategies within the country's education sector plan. So for example, a country might wish to undertake an ANLAS during or as part of its education sector analyses, or at another stage of the education sector planning cycle, whereby the findings of ANLAS can feed into the broader planning process of the country. This also has important implications for the funding of ANLAS, because if a country wishes to conduct it as part of an education sector analysis, it could potentially apply for funding through the GPE Education Sector Plan Development Grant, and to use a part of these resources for the financing of ANLAS. That is a possibility. It's also quite important to note that overall, in situating as part of the broader education sector planning process, it necessitates discussion with the partners that are involved in the planning cycle, including the local education group or the equivalent structure at the country level, in order to identify the best entry point for the country's policy cycle so that the country can make the best use of the findings generated by ANLAS. Next slide, please. So as we developed the initial version of the ANLAS, which, as you will see, is essentially a toolkit consisting of a number of different resources for countries to be able to conduct this diagnostic, we had 3 GPE partner countries, which were Ethiopia, Mauritania, and Vietnam, which piloted ANLAS over the first half of this year. And in the case of these 3 countries, their motivation for piloting ANLAS was because they saw it as a key opportunity to gain systematic information about their national learning assessment systems and to be able to identify areas for improvement in consultation with key stakeholders. They also noted that through conducting ANLAS, there was a good opportunity at hand to translate the strategies identified through ANLAS into the broader education sector planning process. So we'll hear from Mauritania in just a bit to understand more about the motivation and how the piloting process worked there. Next slide, please. But I would like to just zoom in a little bit on the overall ANLAS model to give you a broad snapshot of what the analysis encompasses before turning over to Ursula to walk you through the process and the tools. Next slide. So within ANLAS, the conceptualization of a learning assessment system is derived from an overall vision such that a learning assessment system is broadly defined as a group of policies, practices, structures, organizations, and tools for generating sound, high-quality data on learning and achievement that can provide robust evidence for education policy and practice, with the ultimate aim to improve education quality and learning outcomes. And you can see that this definition is built off the work of a number of different individuals who are referenced in the ANLAS manual. But this is overall the framing definition that we're using for our conception of a learning assessment system. Next slide, please. The quality then of an assessment system is determined by much more than solely administering different types of assessment programs. Instead, it's really about the quality of each single element, so the policies, the practices, the structures, etc., as well as their combined quality, including the linkages and the interactions between different elements of that assessment system. Next slide, please. So ANLAS is in fact a comprehensive and qualitative analysis of the overall system. It is not actually an assessment or an evaluation in and of itself, but rather an analysis of the learning assessment system. And so this qualitative analysis focuses on 3 core dimensions. So firstly, on the context of the assessment system. Secondly, on the quality of the different assessment programs that the country participates in or administers. And thirdly, on the coherence of the assessment system. And we will get further into the details of each of these dimensions in just a couple of minutes. But just to note that these are overall the 3 dimensions of the ANLAS approach. And then we have a broad cross-cutting element, which is the application of knowledge and demonstration of 21st century skills. And this aspect cuts across all 3 of the dimensions of the analysis. Next slide, please. So here you have an illustration of the ANLAS model, which provides the framework for the qualitative analysis of national learning assessment systems. So as I said, it is about the 3 dimensions that are illustrated here. On the left side, the context of the learning assessment system, which covers 4 key areas. Those are legislation or policy, institutional arrangements and governance structures, funding, and leadership. Secondly, the second dimension at the top, in the middle of the screen rather, looks at the quality of assessment programs. And here we're looking at the quality of 3 types of assessment programs. On the one hand, large-scale assessments and examinations, and on the other hand, classroom assessment. And then at the top of the diagram, we have the third dimension, the coherence of the assessment system. And this covers 4 key areas that relate to the extent to which the assessment system is consistent with important aspects of the broader education system. So those include learning standards and curriculum, the education system structure, education priorities, and system-level data use. And as I said, and as illustrated on the right-hand side, the application of knowledge and 21st century skills is an important cross-dimensional element of ANLAS. Next slide, please. So just to hone in a bit on the 21st century skills aspect, so that it's clear what we mean by 21st century skills, within the ANLAS framework, these are defined as skills that build the foundation for successful participation in knowledge-based society and life in general. Depending on the context, these can be known as general capabilities or transversal competencies or cross-curricular competencies. Different countries, different partners define these skills using different terminology. But to give a few examples of what we mean by 21st century skills, we're talking about skills and competencies such as problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, communication, and a suite of other types of skills and competencies. And as I said, the ANLAS process allows us to look across the board at the integration of these skills within a country's national learning assessment system. Next slide, please. So specifically, assessing the application of knowledge and skills as an approach contrasts to approaches that solely focus on the demonstration of factual knowledge and routine procedures. So ANLAS allows us to examine the extent to which learning assessment focuses on the application of knowledge and demonstration of skills, and the extent to which 21st century skills are an integral part of the assessment system. Next slide, please. So just to give an example of how each of the dimensions of ANLAS is analyzed. So here we have, for example, the first dimension, the context of the assessment system. So to analyze each dimension or key area, so underneath context, as I mentioned, we have 4 key areas, which are illustrated in the left-hand column of this table. So for each of these key areas, we have a quality objective that has been defined for each key area, against which that key area is evaluated based on some guiding questions. So this example here shows the 4 key areas and quality objectives for dimension 1. So again, that's the context of the assessment system. So for example, the key area looking at legislation or policy, the quality objective is simply whether or not the assessment system is guided by legislation or policy, which is of course known to be a good practice. And so there are then within the analysis a number of questions that are posed in order for the team to then make an assessment of whether or not this quality objective is met. Or taking another example, funding. The quality objective is whether or not the government provides sufficient and stable funding for the assessment system. And again, there are a number of questions that are posed in order to make an assessment of whether that objective is met. And so then based on this information, aspects that require improvement are identified and recommendations can be made about how the key areas can be improved. So this is essentially the overall process of the analysis. But in order to have more detail about exactly how that analysis is then conducted, the process that is undertaken, as well as the specific tools, I would now call on our colleague Ursula Schwanzner from the Australian Council for Educational Research to present to us the ANLAS processes and tools. So next slide, please, and Ursula's presentation. Ursula, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramya. Hello and welcome everybody to this webinar on ANLAS, and I'm delighted to present the ANLAS processes and tools. Next slide, please. Next slide again. So how is ANLAS implemented? ANLAS has been conceptualized as a country-led participative process that is implemented by a national team and guided by a steering committee. The main methods to undertake the analysis are document review and consultations with key stakeholders in the education system and in the assessment system. And these key stakeholders collaboratively analyze the learning assessment system, identify where improvements are required, and make recommendations. So these stakeholder consultations and the stakeholder involvement is key for the success of ANLAS. So it's beneficial for the uptake of the recommendations to feed into the wider education sector planning process, and an important quality assurance mechanism as well in order to triangulate the information that's gathered and for reaching a consensus about the evaluation categories and recommendations for improvement. All right, I just got a notification to turn on my video, so hello and welcome again everybody to this presentation. Next slide, please. The implementation of ANLAS is guided by the ANLAS manual and a set of tools that are provided as Microsoft Word documents and Microsoft Excel documents. And these tools can be adapted to best fit the national context. And this is important because it ensures that the identified areas and the concrete recommendations for improvement are relevant and appropriate. And in order for you to have a look at the ANLAS manuals and tools, these are all available on the GPE website. There is a more detailed link then also provided at the end of the presentation that leads directly to the ANLAS manual and the ANLAS tools. Next slide, please. Next, please. There is an animation on this slide, so if you click once more, thank you very much. So how is ANLAS implemented? Basically in three main phases. That is the initiation, training and planning phase, followed by the actual analysis phase, and then the reporting and dissemination phase. Let's have a quick look at each of these phases. Next slide, please. The main activities of the initiation, training and planning phase include first the establishment of a national team, a team leader and also a steering committee, then the national team training, various planning activities, and also the conducting of stakeholder briefings to inform all the stakeholders to be involved in the analysis. The corresponding tools for this phase are listed in the right column. Please click next. And so you can see that these consist of various elements like a stakeholder database, the national team training agenda and the presentation to support the team training, then an exercise to identify the stakeholders and the documents that should be part of this analysis, a template for an implementation plan, a template to identify risks and mitigation strategies, a budget template most importantly, and also a PowerPoint presentation to support the stakeholder briefing. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the main processes of the analysis phase are to describe each ANLAS dimension. So that's step one, where the national team reviews relevant documents and provides a basic description for each key area that's based on guiding questions that are in the analytical tables, and I will show an example later of what this looks like. Step 2 in the analysis is to conduct stakeholder consultations to discuss the initial descriptions, evaluate the key areas, and identify aspects and recommendations for improvement for each of the dimensions. So these consultations can be conducted with one or multiple stakeholder groups, for example, or a mix of formats can also be used depending on the availabilities of the stakeholders and also the content of the ANLAS dimension that's under investigation. Following these initial 2 steps, all the information from multiple stakeholder consultations needs to be consolidated and then also synthesized to evaluate the key areas and to really summarize and synthesize all the aspects and recommendations for improvements that have been identified as part of the analysis. The analysis tools are again shown in the right-hand column. Please click Next for the animation. So these include analytical tables for each dimension, which is one for context of the assessment system, then 2 different tables for the quality dimensions, which for one for quality of large-scale assessment and examination, and another one for the quality of classroom assessment, and then also analytical table for dimension 3, the coherence of the assessment system. Synthesis tables are also provided to support the synthesis of the findings. Next, please. Let's have a look at an example analytical table. So each analytical table provides a description table for each key area. This example is taken from analytical table for dimension 1, the context of the assessment system. Please click Next for the animation. So this table here shows first the example key area 3 for funding, and it indicates the related quality objective that Ramya has already provided also in her presentation, which is the government provides sufficient and stable funding for the assessment system. Next, please. Following the quality objective, some of the guiding questions are then provided to support the description and the discussion of the key area. For example, for funding, some questions are, what are the funding sources for each learning assessment program, whether it's government funded, donor funded, or private funded, for example? What proportion of funding comes from each source? And is the funding of learning assessment written into government budgets? So these are some of the more detailed guiding questions that support the analysis of each of the dimensions provided within ANLAS. Next, please. And then the analytical tables also provide space to document the description of the key area based on the document review and the data sources. Next, please. Following the description table for each key area, a second table is then provided to document the results from the stakeholder consultations. So here it provides room to document the evaluation criteria. Next, please. So for each of the key areas, 3 categories have been defined. That's 1 for achieved, there are currently no improvements needed. 2 for partly achieved, indicating that improvements can be made. And 3 for not achieved, so indicating that improvements are required. Next, please. Based on the description and the evaluation of this key area, it is then possible to identify aspects for improvement, and they can then be recorded in this analytical table. And also, next please, there is room in the table to record the recommendations for improvement. Next please. Because it is likely that multiple stakeholder consultations are held for each dimension, the third table provided helps to consolidate the information from multiple stakeholder consultations. Next. So it shows the consolidated evaluation category. Next, please. The consolidated aspects for improvement. And next, please, also there is room to record the consolidated recommendations for improvement. So during this step of consolidation, it may be important to involve the ANLAS steering group, for example, to help make decisions on the consolidated evaluation category or the aspects for improvements and the recommendations as well. So this can be, for example, in the form of the participation in the discussion and consolidation, or otherwise following the analysis to review the consolidated findings, or also to review the synthesis tables, which are up next, please. So the synthesis requires mainly extracting and organizing the information from the consolidated evaluation tables from all key areas and dimensions. There are two tables provided to present the findings. And this example here shows the synthesis table 1, overview of the ANLAS findings, and it's shown for dimension 1, context of the assessment system. And you can see that each key area and the quality objective is allocated according to its evaluation criteria. So this is an example only. So in your country, the result may look completely different, for example, for dimension 1. But this is what a synthesis table looks like. The next slide, please. This example shows synthesis table 2, the ANLAS findings and recommendations. Again, for dimension 1, the context of the assessment system, and again, key area 3, funding. It indicates the key area and the quality objective. Next, please. Then next, please. It shows the consolidated evaluation criteria. And next, please. It also shows the consolidated aspects for improvement and the recommendations for improvement. And you can see that with this slide, one can present and receive a really comprehensive overview of the findings of the analysis presented in a very comprehensive way. Because the consolidated aspects for improvements and the recommendations for improvement all relate to each other, and together they provide information about how to achieve the quality objective for the respective key area. Next slide, please. The final phase is the reporting and dissemination phase. So reporting and dissemination are an essential part of ANLAS to support broad adoption, debate, and use of the findings. So each country develops a dissemination product such as a country report and a summary of key findings and presentations. And the dissemination strategy is also developed to ensure that the recommendations resulting from the analysis are then implemented through the country's education sector planning processes or other policy processes. Next, please. So here on the right side, you can see the reporting and dissemination tools as well, which basically include a template for each of the products to be developed and the dissemination strategy as well. And all these products, dissemination products and the strategy, of course, are also designed to be able to be adapted to best fit the local reporting and dissemination needs. And additional products can also be developed by the national team as needed. Next, please. What are the outcomes of ANLAS? We will hear more about that also in the next presentation from the Mauritania team. But the comprehensive reporting process basically allows to describe the findings for each dimension in detail, to identify patterns of strengths and weaknesses across the key areas, dimensions, or even across the different assessment programs, and also to really formulate recommendations for improvement that can later then be implemented. For more information, the detailed reports from ANLAS for the piloting countries, Ethiopia, Mauritania, and Vietnam, are all available on the GPE website. Next, please. I'm coming to the final set of slides for my presentation, which is to also give you an indicative time frame for ANLAS. So in principle, a period of 6 months is considered as an indicative time frame for ANLAS, with a national team of 8 to 12 members that is working on ANLAS part-time. But the time required to undertake ANLAS really varies depending on the resources and the needs of each country. So for example, your time frame will very much depend on the size and the composition and the availability of the national team, the scope of the analysis, so the number and the kind of assessment programs that are included, and the number of stakeholders consulted during the analysis phase, the availability of the stakeholders for the consultations, and perhaps also the need to translate the ANLAS manuals and tools. Next, please. The next few slides just show the indicative time frame for ANLAS in more detail. So you see for the initiation, training and planning phase, this is really variable to the country or the local customs. For the training itself, we recommend a period of 2 days, and the planning activity is also 1 to 2 weeks, for example. Next, please. The analysis phase can take anything from between 8 and 10 weeks, with different duration for each of the phases, but this really depends on the more detailed planning at the country level for this phase as well, and how the analysis is structured and implementing based on the implementation plan. Next, please. The reporting and dissemination phase. We have also scheduled, based on the experiences from the pilot implementations, a period of 8 to 10 weeks to prepare the reporting for ANLAS, the report and the summary of key findings and the key findings presentations, but also to think about and to develop a more detailed dissemination strategy. Next, please. This is the last slide of my presentation. So in order to gain more information about ANLAS, please visit the GPE website. The detailed link is provided on this slide, and also feel free to contact us at the GPE or at ACR, and our email addresses are provided here as well. Thank you very much, and next slide, please. I hand over to Ramya again. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ursula. And actually, in my introduction of Ursula, I forgot to say one important thing, which is that Ursula, as I mentioned, is based at ACER in Melbourne. GPE actually worked with ACER specifically for the development of ANLAS, as well as the piloting and finalization. So we would like to also thank Ursula and her team at ACER for the excellent work. And in the case of the piloting in Mauritania, ACER worked quite closely with Confemen and with the PASEC team. So with that, before we open up for questions and discussion, we'll go ahead and go to our next presentation, which will be a joint presentation delivered by Ousmane Birba from Confemen PASEC, based in Dakar, along with Mr. Mohamed Salem, who was the focal point for ANLAS in Mauritania, based in Nouakchott. So we'll just get the presentation up, and then we'll turn it over to Ousmane, I believe, to start. Ousmane, are you with us in Dakar?
Yes, he is. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning. I will not go back on the presentation that our colleagues made. I am from Confemen, and I will present the analysis of PASEC. We had the opportunity to work on a pilot for ANLAS in Mauritania. I will quickly go to my presentation on several points. The introduction, I'm having difficulty hearing the gentleman. So, our presentation will be on the following: an introduction, then we will present the implementation for the pilot phase in Mauritania, and then the results, and then the recommendation. I will talk about the first 2 points. So the implementation for the pilot phase, and my colleague Salem will go to the results and the recommendation on this pilot in Mauritania. Next. Here we are. So here, why did Mauritania get interested in this project? The Ministry of Education has adopted the qualitative improvement of its assessment system, and we were in a final phase for our sector plan for education. So it was an opportunity for Mauritania to use the results of this project in order to feed in the sector plan for education 2021-2030. So that was the principal motivation for Mauritania. So the schedule for implementation of the pilot went from March 2019 to July. Next. How did we implement the pilot in Mauritania? We have several steps. We'll go quickly that where we were able to implement this pilot in Mauritania. Next. So we had 6 steps for the implementation. The first one was to constitute a local national team in Mauritania that would lead the pilot, then an information phase for all the stakeholders to take part in the study. Then, third, the ownership tools by the national team and for all the stakeholders so they can own the program, and then a training phase for the team, national team. Next, please. Fifth step was the implementation, so filing the data, consultation with the stakeholders. And the last phase was the drafting of a national report and dissemination thereof and the results in a more detailed way. Next, please. Next, please. I will just review the 6 phases that I just listed. As I told you earlier, for the Conferment and PASEC, we supported Mauritania in the implementation of this pilot phase. So the PASEC focal point and my colleague, Guy Roger, with the national team in Mauritania, Mr. Salem, who will make the presentation after me, and he is the focal point, and he worked in collaboration and cooperation for the implementation of this pilot phase. Next, please. So the first meeting or the first activity was in the implementation of the pilot phase was the information meeting of all the stakeholders. Next, please. Thank you. So this first phase was to inform all the stakeholders for the objectives and the process of implementation of ANLAS, and with civil servants, the heads of schools, our partners, our team, which enabled us to support the common understanding of the objectives and of this process for the implementation of ANLAS, not only between the national team, but also with all the stakeholders. So this was a phase that was mandatory and for the collaboration and cooperation for the success of this initiative. Next, please. After this first phase of information of all stakeholders that was implemented by the GPE, we had the training of the national team and the planning of activities that was done from end to end by the PASEC team with the focal point for Mauritania. So this activity for the training of the national team had an objective to have the common understanding of the framework, the tools, and the objectives of ANLAS. It enabled the national team to have ownership of the ANLAS tools. We should note here that we had a lot of documents that first we had to translate them from English to French. And Confamen dealt with it, and then we had to train the national team so they would have ownership of all the documents and of the process for the implementation of this pilot phase. So this training enabled us also to go to planning, that was listing all the stakeholders that would be pertinent, and to list all the documents that would be necessary and pertinent that would be consulted in the framework of this project. This phase also enabled us to go into planning of the consultation in collaboration with the stakeholders for collecting data. So we had a framework for these consultations. Next, please. After the training and the planning phase and the consultations, now we went into data collection. What was it? Here, it was to have consultations with the stakeholders that were enumerated and to look at the documents that were collected during the training phase for the national team. And this consultation for all the stakeholders was done through several methods and depending on their specific type. So, the objectives were the following: to collect data on the evaluation systems, then the cohesion thereof, and then the quality of the assessment programs. One should note that collecting data on all these three domains followed the three steps that I listed earlier. So, description of data, their assessment, and recommendations. For each type, for the context of the evaluation or the assessment, we collected data on the description of the context, on evaluation and assessment, and the recommendation. I just wanted to note here that the consultations were either individual or collective, according to the availability and the type of each group. Next, please. As I told you earlier, for all third types of evaluation, we filled the tables for synthesis, and this was done, first of all, in describing the key areas. Then we assessed the key areas in relevance for each category, and then we went into the synthesis of the results in order to be able to assess all these key areas. Next, please. Here we are. Thank you. What one should say is that the filling out of the synthesis tables, We found with the national team, we found items to be able to collect data and proceed with the evaluation or the assessment, which we did, instead of having the assessment separately, where stakeholders were not available. The tables were filled, and then the evaluation was done at their level. What are the challenges for filling the tables? Next, please.
I was talking about the problems that we met in this consultation stage. So the program that had been established had some problems due to the presidential election that took place at the same time and due to national examinations. And also we had teachers' strikes. So this kind of delayed this particular assessment and consultation stage of the stakeholders. I will add that there was a whole lot of documents that had to be read, that had to be given to stakeholders, and that was not easy either, given the volume, the sheer volume of documentation. So all these elements were taken into account in the finalization of ANLAS tools. Next slide. So this is the last phase. It's the implementation phase for the ANLAS pilot in Mauritania. We first had to do the preparation of the report and the documents to present the ANLAS results. What must be said for the preparation of the report is that we had to draw the different recommendations and the different results after the consultation of the different stakeholders. The national team, in order to do that, and with the help of the Mauritania focal point and the Confirmem focal point, we consolidated the different data and the different results that we got from the assessment. And after these consolidated results, we proposed recommendations, which you can find in the report. So one report format has been proposed and slightly adapted to the reality in Mauritania. The different stakeholders amended the report. They gave their feedback, and we had a final version. So we had a PowerPoint document and a Word document. All these documents have been shared with people who were responsible for different education departments and people who were in charge of planning. Now I'm going to give the floor to my friend Salem, who is going to quickly show you the results of this pilot phase and how these results were actually useful for Mauritania. So I thank you. And next slide, please. Now I'm giving the floor, I give back the floor to Ramya. so that she can give the floor to Salim. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Salam, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm happy to share with you the pilot experience that we did in Mauritania. I thank Usman for his presentation of the process. And now I'm going to take advantage of having the floor to give you the results of this particular inquiry and survey. Next slide, please. Thank you. As you've already heard it during the first presentation, the results are co-signed. At first, we had an assessment of the different major axes for the different assessment programs. That is to say that we have major axes that had to be assessed based on their description and based on the answer to questions. So both for the context and the coherence of the assessment system and the quality of the assessment programs. So in the next slides, you're going to see the results of the assessment done in Mauritania. Next slide, please. That's the new slide, thank you. Here are the results of the assessment for the assessment system context. So you have 6 main axes where each axis is associated to a goal. So the aim here is to give the results of the assessment of the aims in the context. You can see that no goal has been reached in a definitive way. I draw your attention to the fact that this is a unanimous assessment. This is the assessment of all the stakeholders and confirmed by the national team on the basis of the answers to the question. So if you look at this table, you realize that no objective, no goal has been completely reached. And yet you see that 2 objectives were partially achieved, and 4 were not reached at all. That's for the context. Now, if you go to the next slide, this slide is the coherence of the assessment system. It's the assessment of the objective compared to the coherence goals. We still realize that absolutely no objective has been achieved. Yet 2 objectives in this context have been achieved, and 2 have been partially reached, structure and learning. So in terms of educational policies, development, and utilization of the data, this has not been achieved. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here you have the results of the large-scale assessment. And here, in the evaluation of knowledge of the students, in a large-scale assessment, we have analyzed the assessment done by the National Assessment Unit, CNE, at the national level. And also, we have done a recent assessment in 2018, done by the World Bank, on the indicators. It's called the SDI in English, so we call it SDI too. It's PSE in French, SDI in English. So for the first table, 3A, we have the results of the assessment in terms of large-scale assessment done by the SDI. And we realize that same thing, no objective has been achieved. For the different major axes, there are 7 of them. Then we have, out of the 7, 6 have been partially achieved. And in terms of the assessment framework, this objective has not been achieved at all. Next slide, please, for SDI. Thank you. This table gives you an assessment of SDI, the indicators done in 2018 by the World Bank. There, you see, on the other hand, that the objectives realized in terms of organization, sampling, field operation, data management, and data analysis, the team thinks that every single one of these objectives has been completely achieved. Yet, in terms of reporting and dissemination, it has not been totally reached. And there's a comment. The World Bank decided recently to organize a workshop that will take place at the beginning of December. So for this particular assessment, most of the objectives have been reached, as you can see. Next slide, please. Thank you. On this slide, you see the assessment of national exams. This has been, it's a work done by the exam direction. On the 8 objectives, none has been completely achieved. But 7 of the 8 are considered as having been partially achieved. The most important one was the quality of the assessment tools. That's not achieved at all. Next slide, please. Thank you. For the very last slide, dealing with the objective assessment, we are talking about the quality of class-level assessment. So these are large-scale assessments, assessment of national exams, and assessment in the classroom. For the assessment in the classroom, you see the results. As to the 7 objectives, only 1 is considered as having been partially achieved. None of the other objectives have been reached or achieved at all. This is the result of the assessment of the different data. We can go to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. This is a summary of what we just said. According to the objectives related to the key areas, with regard to context and coherence, only 2 were attained, albeit partially the other objectives were not attained at all. With regard to the quality of learning outcomes assessment, the results vary from program to program. In the case of national large-scale assessment and national examinations, the data show partial achievements of the objectives, except for one key area. Based on the SDI indicator, the objectives have been achieved for the key areas. But so far, the report dissemination strategy seems to be inadequate. However, the quality of classroom assessments seems to be less effective, as 6 of 7 objectives not achieved. So, this is the summary, if you want, of the assessment of the different domains that were assessed. Now, we are going to recommendations. So, you noticed it earlier. It's the same thing. Finally,
Mr. Salem, excuse me for interrupting you. Would it be possible to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, because we don't have much time left and we have a few questions that we've received. So can you highlight just some of the recommendations? And sorry to cut you off.
No problem. I'll go a little bit faster. In terms of the recommendations, here we proposed a recommendation. Instead of looking at what needs to be improved, we can imagine what can really be improved. In the context, we have to enact an education policy. These are recommendations made by stakeholders. We propose also to develop discipline-based assessment frameworks, and to put in the syllabus specific directives, explicitly include assessment of the 21st century skills, because we notice that 21st century skills do not exist as such, and yet all the people we talk to think that 21st century skills are essential, and we can find them here and there. So the proposition here is to integrate 21st century skills in the assessments. Integrate the assessment objectives in a matrix of sector action plans, set up effective communication tools in order to inform sector actors, build the capacities of decision makers, teachers, trainers, heads of institutions, and teachers as regards using and implementing learning outcomes. So I think since we don't have much time, all we can say is that there is an absence of orientation documents. There is not enough sharing of the assessment, not enough financing for the assessments, especially for large-scale assessments. So now, these were, now the next was details. So you can find the recommendations in a report for Mauritania. So now I'm going to the utilization of the results. The planning process starts with a good diagnosis of the sector. This is what is done every 5 years. This diagnosis is based on recent data and varied data in the macroeconomic and demographic context. And this is a good start for new 21st century skills. So next slide for the utilization. So you can go directly to that slide. Next slide. Yes. One more slide. Thank you. Next slide. Next. The diagnosis, next slide. Next slide, please. Next one. No, you went too far. That's right. That's a good one. So the education system planning, we noticed that we have a sectoral plan, 1 and 2, between 2000 and 2020. And then there's a sectoral plan, which is going to start in 2021 and go until 2030. Where can put the ANLAS results? We have to take into account the recommendations of the ANLAS project in the 3-year plan and in the 2021-2030 plan. On top of what is going to be proposed in 2020. We have to integrate. We have to do the integration of ANLAS in all these plans in order to feed the diagnosis. Next, please. Next slide. Next slide. The activities proposed as part of the implementation of the recommendations based on the ANLAS study will be integrated on a priority basis into the sector plans, 2019-2021, 2021-2030, and here we have listed all the activities that we think are a priority. So you have now a list of activities that should be planned in the action plans. Next slide. That is the list of, for people who are interested, it's a list of different activities that we propose that have been identified through recommendations and that seem to be a priority for us and that could be integrated in the action plans and especially in the 2021-2030 plan of action. Thank you very much. I'll stop here and I'm sorry for having been so long. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Salem. Thank you, Usman, and thank you, Ursula, as well, for your contributions. We now have a little less than 10 minutes, I'm sorry to say, since we started a little bit late, but to have some discussion, some questions and answers. And as a reminder for the participants, whether you're following in the English or the French channel, you can send us your questions using the chat function of the YouTube in the channel that you're following, or you can also send us an email. Your question can be sent via email to webinars@globalpartnership.org. So we've received one question so far, so I'll go ahead and read this out loud. And I think I can begin to respond, but also Ursula, Usman, and Salem, you can also come in because it's actually three questions, but from one person. So this is a question from a colleague from the PAL network, which is the network of the global network of citizen-led assessments. So there are a few questions. The first question, from the piloting, how much hand-holding or guidance from GPE and or ACER is needed while implementing ANLAS? So in other words, how much support, if a country decides to undertake ANLAS, what support, if any, would they need from GPE and or ACER? The second question is, what are the indicative costs to carry out the analysis? So the costs for a country to undertake an ANLAS. And then the third question, based on the findings from the analysis, are there a set of standard recommendations that countries can try and start implementing? So across different countries, are there a set of standard recommendations that that countries should consider? So these are three questions that have been received. So I can start in terms of responding. So the idea during the piloting phase was that the three countries, Ethiopia, Mauritania, and Vietnam, worked quite closely, particularly with ACER, which had a dedicated country liaison for that country to support the piloting process, including all steps from the training to the data collection and the analysis to the reporting. But overall, ANLAS is designed such that a country should, in theory, be able to undertake the analysis without any external support from the part of GPE or ACER or any other external body. So all of the revisions that were made to the tools were done in a manner such that they are considered to be user-friendly, adaptable to the local context, and easy for a country to use on its own through a national team supported by a steering committee, as Ursula has explained. A country may, of course, based on its particular context and the resources that it has available, make use of external support, call upon some external support to undertake this process. But the idea is that it should be driven by the country, and the tools are formulated in that vein. In terms of the second question about the indicative costs, we estimate that overall, a country would need a budget roughly of about $16,000 in order to carry out the ANLAS from start to finish. And again, as Ursula said, this is on an indicative time frame of about 6 months, with a national team of about 8 to 12 members who are working on a part-time basis because, of course, they have their normal job duties. So the costs as well as the timeline obviously depends on the country context. So there could be a great deal of variation in that regard. But this is our estimate based on the experience of these three pilot countries. And lastly, in terms of whether there's a standard set of recommendations. So I would say no, because the idea of ANLAS is that it's really meant to be a process that is implemented by each country, an analysis that each country makes vis-a-vis these overall domains, key areas, and quality objectives. But the situation of each country is vastly different, and therefore the recommendations would naturally, logically also be quite different depending on the situation of the country. So the pilot experience was in three countries that are each very different from each other. And so you would see, once we publish the reports of these three countries on the GPE website, the recommendations are also quite different. But we hope that a greater number of countries will undertake the ANLAS, and therefore eventually we might see that there are some common recommendations across countries. But really it depends on the particular situation of each country. I don't know if Ursula or Usman or Mr. Salem, if you would like to add anything in terms of these questions.
Hi, it's Ursula here. I just would like to add to the very last question that it was really great to see through the pilot implementation that each piloting country really found great ways to adapt the ANLAS guidelines and processes to the local context and to identify the best way to implement the analysis in the context. So, yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ursula. We have another question from the ANSEFA Nairobi office. The colleague would like to know, are there universal standards that countries, particularly in Africa, can learn from when developing their plans? I presume that this means plans in regard to learning assessment systems, but it's not clear from the question. But the question seems to be, in general, if there are universal standards that countries, particularly African countries, can learn from or apply. I might ask Ursula to come in on this, but maybe I could just start by saying that overall for ANLAS, for the three core focus areas, so context, coherence, and quality, for each of the key areas, as we said, there is a quality objective that is defined. And for example, in terms of legislation or policy, whether or not there's legislation and policy that guides the national assessment system. So in many ways, one could consider that the quality objectives are a representation of sorts of universal standards or good practice in relation to that key area. And these quality objectives have been defined, have been formulated both based on, I would say, ACER in particular's experience in working with a range of countries throughout the world, as well as on research and their literature. So these can be considered in a sense as universal standards, but Ursula, if you would like to complement that, that would be great.
Yes, thank you very much, Ramya. So as Ramya indicated, that a lot of resources have been used to develop the ANLAS framework and tools as well. So in particular, this included the frameworks from World Bank SABER, the systematic SABER, the indicator 15 of the GPE results framework, but also in particular what's relevant for African countries is the framework from the Network for the African Learning Assessments for evaluating learning assessment systems, the NALA, for example. So this is also to be highlighted, to be as one of the main resources that are underlying the ANLAS framework and the quality criteria that have been used to define the quality objectives and to derive the guiding questions as well. Did that answer the question, Ramya?
So another question that we've received from Mr. Koulibaly is, what is the process for a country that wishes to undertake ANLAS to initiate the process of doing so? So as we mentioned, ANLAS was launched a couple of weeks ago at the end of October on the GPE website. And there you have the entire toolkit, all of the tools in English for the time being. We are currently working to translate the entire toolkit into French as well, and that will soon also be available on the GPE website. So overall, if a country wishes to conduct ANLAS and it is a GPE partner country, we would encourage the country to start a dialogue with the coordinating agency in the country and with the local education group in order to determine, one, whether or not it would be useful for the country to undertake ANLAS, and then two, to start the dialogue in terms of identifying the timeline, the resources, and the other practical details for doing so. So it's really a decision that has to be made at the country level, and in the case of GPE countries, that should include the local education group and the coordinating agency. And then, of course, if there are any questions in terms of the tools and the process and any further inquiries, then, of course, you can be in touch with us, with myself in particular, and you have all of the contact information on the GPE website. And I see that we have perhaps just one last question, as we are out of time. But the last question is, what is the specificity of ANLAS compared to other compared to other such similar programs? I think, if I've understood the question, this is from Madame Keke, who's asking, what is the particularity or the specificity of ANLAS vis-a-vis other similar tools? So Ursula, if you don't mind, I would like to turn this question over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the distinctive features of ANLAS are indeed the country-led participative process of ANLAS and the diagnostic nature to really analyze each of the quality dimensions in detail and to derive aspects for improvement and recommendations that are meaningful to the local context. And in addition to that, also the cross-dimensional consideration of the 21st century skills to see how much this is considered in the different learning assessment programs, but also in the whole learning assessment system overall. This is also a very distinctive feature of ANLAS.
Great, thank you. I believe that we are unfortunately out of time, so apologies that we couldn't have as much time as we would have liked for questions and answers since we got a bit of a late start. But we would like to conclude by thanking you all for joining this webinar and for the interest that you've shown in regard to ANLAS. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Ursula, Usman, and Mr. Salem for joining and for sharing their perspectives. As we've said, we've shown you the link to the ANLAS toolkit, which is available on the GPE website. And we will soon be publishing there as well the country reports from Ethiopia, Mauritania, and Vietnam, as well as the full French version of the toolkit. If you have any questions or if you have further interest in ANLAS, you can feel free to contact us. All of the participants in this webinar will be receiving all of the presentations as well as a recording of the webinar in English or French, based on which channel you registered for. So thank you again, and we wish you all a great day, and we hope you'll join us for another webinar in the future from the Global Partnership for Education. Thank you.